unresolved the question of who would dominate Europe. The tremendous dislocations caused by the war laid the groundwork for the collapse of democratic institutions there and set the stage for a second German attempt at conquest. A worldwide depression that began in 1929 destroyed the fragile democratic regime in Germany. In 1933, Adolf Hitler led to power the National Socialist German Workers, the Nazi Party, a mass movement that was virulently nationalistic, anti-democratic, and anti-Semitic. He ended parliamentary government, assumed dictatorial powers, and proclaimed the Third Reich. The Nazi government increased the strength of the German armed forces and sought to overturn the Versailles Treaty, to recover German territory lost at the peace settlement, and to return to the so-called fatherland German-speaking minorities within the borders of surrounding countries. The ultimate goal of Hitler's policy was to secure living space for the German master race in Eastern Europe. A gambler by instinct, Hitler relied on diplomatic bluff and military innovation to overcome Germany's weaknesses. He played skillfully on the divisions among the European powers to gain many of his aims without war. With the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, he announced a Rome-Berlin alliance, the Axis, in 1935. Meanwhile, in the Far East, the Japanese, the only Asian industrial power, coveted the natural resources of China and Southeast Asia, but found their expansion blocked by European colonial powers or by the United States. Having seized Manchuria in 1931, they began a war against China in 1937. The League of Nations failed to counter effectively Japanese aggression in Manchuria and an Italian invasion of Ethiopia. Soon, Germany, Italy, and Japan became allies, facing Western democratic governments that wanted to avoid another war, and the Soviet Union, whose communist government was widely distrusted. The people of the United States, having rejected the Versailles Treaty and the Covenant of the League of Nations after World War I, remained largely indifferent to most international concerns. They firmly discounted the likelihood of American involvement in another major war, except perhaps with Japan. Isolationist strength in Congress led to the passage of the Neutrality Act of 1937, making it unlawful for the United States to trade with belligerents. American policy aimed at continental defense and designated the Navy as the first line of such defense. The Army's role was to serve as the nucleus of a mass mobilization that would defeat any invaders who managed to fight their way past the Navy and the nation's powerful coastal defense installations. The National Defense Act of 1920 allowed an army of 280,000, the largest in peacetime history. But until 1939, Congress never appropriated funds to pay for much more than half of that strength. Most of the funds available for new equipment went to the fledgling Air Corps. Throughout most of the interwar period, the Army was tiny and insular, filled with hard-bitten, long-serving volunteers, scattered in small garrisons throughout the continental United States, Hawaii, the Philippines, and Panama. Yet some innovative thinking and preparation for the future took place in the interwar Army. Experiments with armored vehicles and motorization, air-ground cooperation, and the aerial transport of troops came to nothing for lack of resources and of consistent high-level support. The Army did, however, develop an interest in amphibious warfare and in related techniques that were then being pioneered by the U.S. Marine Corps. By the outbreak of war, the Signal Corps was a leader in improving radio communications, and American artillery practiced the most sophisticated fire direction and control techniques in the world. In addition, war plans for various contingencies had been drawn up, as had industrial and manpower mobilization plans. During the early 1930s, Colonel George C. Marshall, assistant commandant of the infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia, had earmarked a number of younger officers for leadership positions. Despite such preparations, the army as a whole was unready for the war that broke out in Europe on the 1st September 1939. The outbreak of war. During March 1938, German troops had occupied Austria, incorporating it into the Reich. In September, Hitler announced that the oppression of ethnic Germans living in Czechoslovakia was intolerable and that war was near. England and France met with Hitler, the Munich Pact, and compelled Czechoslovakia to cede its frontier districts to Germany in order to secure peace in our time. Peace, however, was only an illusion. During March 1939, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia by force of arms and then turned his attention to Poland. Although Britain and France had guaranteed the integrity of Poland, Hitler and Joseph Stalin, dictator of the Soviet Union, signed a secret, mutual, non-aggression pact in August 1939. With the pact, Stalin bought time to build up his strength at the expense of Britain and France, and Hitler gained a free hand to deal with Poland. When Hitler's army invaded Poland on the 1st September 1939, World War II began. While German forces overran Western Poland, Soviet troops entered from the east to claim their portion of that country. France and Britain declared war on Germany and mobilized their forces. The subsequent period of deceptive inactivity, lasting until spring, became known as the Foamy War. Nothing happened to indicate that World War II would differ significantly in style or tempo from World War I, but the years since 1918 had brought important developments in the use of tanks. A number of students of war, the British Sir Basil Liddell Hart and J.F.C. Fuller, the Frenchman Charles de Gaulle, the American George S. Patton, and the Germans Oswald Lutz and Heinz Guderian believed that armored vehicles held the key to restoring decision to the battlefield. But only the Germans conceived the idea of massing tanks in division-size units, with infantry, artillery, engineers, and other supporting arms mechanized and all moving at the same pace. Moreover, only Lutz and Guderian received the enthusiastic support of their government. In the spring of 1940, their theories were put to the test as German forces struck against Norway and Denmark in April, invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg in May, and late in the same month broke through a hilly, wooded district in France. Their columns sliced through to the English Channel, cutting off British and French troops in northern France and Belgium. The French army, plagued by low morale, divided command, and primitive communications, fell apart. The British evacuated their forces from Dunkirk with the loss of most of their equipment. The Germans entered Paris on 14th June, and the French government, defeatist and deeply divided politically, sued for an armistice. The success of the German Blitzkrieg forced the remaining combatants to rethink their doctrine and restructure their armies. With his forces occupying northern France and with a puppet French government established in the south, Hitler launched the Luftwaffe against the airfields and cities of England to pave the way for an invasion. Britain's survival hung by a thread. From July to October 1940, while German landing barges and invasion forces waited on the Channel coasts, the Royal Air Force, greatly outnumbered, drove the Luftwaffe from the daytime skies in the legendary Battle of Britain. At sea, the British Navy, with increasing American cooperation, fought a desperate battle against German submarine packs to keep the North Atlantic open. British pugnacity finally forced Hitler to abandon all plans to invade England. In February, Hitler sent troops under Lieutenant General Erwin Rommel to aid the Italians who were fighting against the British in North Africa. German forces coming to the aid of the Italians in the Balkans routed a British expedition in Greece, and German paratroopers seized the important island of Crete. Then, in June 1944, Hitler turned against his supposed ally, the Soviet Union, with the full might of the German armed forces. Armored spearheads thrust deep into Soviet territory, driving toward Leningrad, Moscow, and the Ukraine, and cutting off entire Soviet armies. Despite tremendous losses, Russian military forces withdrew farther into the country and continued to resist. Nazi expectations of a quick victory evaporated, and the onset of winter caught the Germans unprepared. 30 miles short of Moscow, their advance ground to a halt, and the Soviets launched massive counterattacks. The Germans withstood the counterattacks and resumed their offensive the following spring. The Soviets, now locked in a titanic death struggle, faced the bulk of the German land forces, over 200 divisions. The front stretched for 2,000 miles, from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea. Soon, casualties ran into the millions, waging war with the implacable ruthlessness of totalitarian regimes. Both sides committed wholesale atrocities, mistreatment of prisoners of war, enslavement of civilian populations, and, in the case of the Jews, outright genocide. In the United States, preparations for war moved slowly. General George C. Marshall took over as Chief of Staff in 1939, but the Army remained hard-pressed simply to carry out its mission of defending the continental United States. Defending overseas possessions like the Philippines seemed a hopeless task. In early 1939, prompted by fears that a hostile power might be able to establish air bases in the Western Hemisphere, thus exposing the Panama Canal or continental United States to aerial attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt launched a limited preparedness campaign. The power of the Army Air Corps increased. Army and Navy leaders drafted a new series of war plans to deal with the threatening international situation. The focus of military policy changed from continental to hemisphere defense. After the outbreak of war in Europe, the president proclaimed a limited emergency and authorized increases in the size of the regular army and the National Guard. Congress amended the Neutrality Act to permit munitions sales to the French and British, and large orders from them stimulated retooling and laid the basis for the expansion of war production in the future. The Army concentrated on equipping its regular forces as quickly as possible, and in 1940 held the first large-scale corps and army maneuvers in American history. The rapid defeat of France and the possible collapse of Britain dramatically accelerated defense preparations. Roosevelt directed the transfer of large stocks of World War I munitions to France and Britain in the spring of 1940. And went further in September when he agreed to the transfer of 50 overage destroyers to Britain in exchange for bases in the Atlantic and Caribbean. In March 1941, Congress repealed some provisions of the Neutrality Act. Passage of the Lend-Lease Act, which gave the president authority to sell, transfer, or lease war goods to the government of any country whose defenses he deemed vital to the defense of the United States, spelled the virtual end of neutrality. The president proclaimed that the United States would become the arsenal of democracy. In the spring of 1941, American and British military representatives held their first combined staff conferences to discuss strategy in the event of active U.S. participation in the war, which seemed increasingly likely to include Japan as well as Germany. The staffs agreed that if the United States entered the war, the Allies should concentrate on the defeat of Germany first. The president authorized active naval patrols in the western half of the Atlantic, and in July, American troops took the place of British forces guarding Iceland. Meanwhile, General Marshall and Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson made plans to expand the Army to 1.5 million men. On 27 August 1940, Congress approved inducting the National Guard into federal service and calling up the reserves. A few weeks later, the lawmakers passed the Selective Service and Training Act, the first peacetime draft in American history. By mid-1941, the Army had achieved its planned strength, with 27 infantry, 5 armored, and 2 cavalry divisions, 35 air groups, and a host of support units, but it remained far from ready to deploy overseas against well-equipped, experienced, and determined foes. The United States enters the war on 7th December 1941. While German armies were freezing before Moscow, Japan suddenly pushed the United States into the struggle by attacking the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 4 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States. President Roosevelt called on Congress for immediate and massive expansion of the armed forces. 20 years of neglect and indifference, however, could not be overcome in a few days. Helpless as American garrisons in the Pacific fell to the Japanese in the spring of 1942, military leaders in Washington worked feverishly to create a headquarters that could direct a distant war effort and to turn the fledgling ground and air units into viable, balanced fighting forces. In early 1942, the Joint Chiefs of Staff emerged as a committee of the nation's military leaders to advise the president and to coordinate strategy with the British. In March, the War Department General Staff was reorganized and the Army divided into 3 major commands: the Air Forces, Ground Forces, and Service Forces. 37 Army divisions were in some state of training, but only one was fully trained, equipped, and deployable by January 1942. Army planners of the time estimated that victory would require an army of nearly 9 million men organized into 215 combat divisions. Estimates that proved accurate regarding overall manpower, but too ambitious for the 90 divisions that eventually were established and supported on far-flung battlefields. Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, head of Army Ground Forces and an ardent advocate of mobile war, oversaw the development of armored and airborne divisions. He directed the restructuring of existing organizations as well, turning the old World War I square division based on 4 infantry regiments into a lighter, more maneuverable, triangular division with 3 infantry regiments. A serious and continuing shortage of Allied shipping space placed absolute limits on the size and capabilities of Army units. New tables of organization stressed leanness and mobility, sometimes at the expense of fighting power and endurance. Billeting, training areas, and equipment were all in short supply. American industry had to support the nation's allies as well as its own military expansion. Britain needed large amounts of munitions and equipment, and Lend-Lease aid, including tens of thousands of trucks and other vehicles and equipment, played an important part in mechanizing the Soviet army. Amphibious warfare required large numbers of landing craft and support vessels, yet to be built. The first U.S. troops arrived in the British Isles in January 1942, but nearly a year passed before they went into action against the Axis. Meanwhile, air power provided virtually the only means for the Allies to strike at Germany. The Royal Air Force began its air offensive against Germany in May 1942, and on the 4th of July, the first American crews participated in air raids against the continent. In early 1942, British and American leaders reaffirmed the priority of the European theater. General Marshall argued for an immediate buildup of American forces in Great Britain, a possible diversionary attack on the continent in the fall, and a definite full-scale invasion in 1943. The British greeted this program with caution, remembering the enormous casualties of World War I. They preferred to strike at German power in the Mediterranean, rather than risk a direct confrontation in haste. Although acknowledging the eventual necessity for an invasion of France, they hoped to defer it until much later. Instead, Prime Minister Winston S. Churchill suggested Anglo-American landings in North Africa, bringing the French armies in France's colonies there back into the war on the side of the Allies and aiding the British in their fight against the Italians and the forces of German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Months of lively debate followed, but ultimately, President Roosevelt directed General Marshall to plan and carry out amphibious landings on the coast of North Africa, BEF. The North African Campaign. Marshall ordered Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower, then in England, to take command of the invasion. Meeting the November deadline required improvisation of every kind. Army troops were hurriedly trained in amphibious warfare. Technicians modified commercial vessels to serve as landing ships. While General Eisenhower monitored operations from Gibraltar, American forces, convoyed directly from the United States, landed along the Atlantic coast of French Morocco near Casablanca. Meanwhile, American and British troops sailing from England landed in Algeria. Despite efforts to win support among French military officers in North Africa, some fighting occurred. Nevertheless, negotiations soon led to a ceasefire, and French units joined the Allied forces. While the Allies tightened their grip on Morocco and Algeria, their troops raced to reach strategic positions in neighboring Tunisia. A month earlier, the British in Egypt under Lieutenant General Sir Bernard L. Montgomery had mounted a powerful attack on the Germans at El Alamein, sending Rommel and his German-Italian Panzer Army reeling back into Libya. If strong Allied forces could reach the coast of Tunisia, Rommel would be trapped between them and Montgomery's troops. Awake to the threat, the Germans poured troops into Tunisia by air and sea, brushing aside weak French forces there. Axis air power, based in Sicily, Sardinia, and Italy, pounded the advancing Allied columns. As torrential December rains turned the countryside into a quagmire, the Allies lost the race. Instead of catching Rommel, they faced a protracted struggle. While his forces dug in along the southern border of Tunisia opposite Montgomery, a second powerful Axis force, the 5th Panzer Army, barred the way to the Tunisian coast. A chain of mountains separates coastal Tunisia from the arid interior. In a plain between two arms of the mountains, and behind the passes in the west, lay important Allied airfields and supply dumps. On 14 February 1943, the Axis commanders sent German and Italian forces through the passes, hoping to penetrate the American positions and either envelop the British in the north or seize Allied supply depots. German forces quickly cut off and overwhelmed 2 battalions of American infantry positioned too far apart for mutual support, and the experienced panzers beat back counterattacks by American reserves, including elements of the U.S. 1st Armored Division. U.S. troops began evacuating airfields and supply depots on the plain and falling back to the western arm of the mountains. Dug in around the oasis town of Spitla, American infantry and armor managed to hold off the Germans through 16 February. But defenses there began to disintegrate during the night, and the town lay empty by midday on the 17th. From the oasis, roads led back to 2 passes, the Spiba and the Kasserine. By 21st February, the Germans had pushed through both and were poised to seize road junctions leading to the British rear. Rommel and other German commanders, however, could not agree on how to exploit their success. Meanwhile, Allied reinforcements rushed to the critical area. The 1st Armored Division turned back German probes toward Tebessa, and British armor met a more powerful thrust toward Fala, where 4 battalions of field artillery from the U.S. 9th Infantry Division arrived just in time to bolster sagging defenses. On the night of 22nd February, the Germans began to pull back. A few days later, Allied forces returned to the passes. The first American battle with German forces had cost more than 6,000 U.S. casualties, including 300 dead and 2/3 of the tank strength of the 1st Armored Division. In March, after the British repulsed another German attack, the Allies resumed the offensive. The U.S. II Corps, now under the command of Major General George S. Patton, attacked in coordination with an assault on the German line by Montgomery's troops. American and British forces in the south met on 7 April as they squeezed Axis forces into the northeastern tip of the country. The final drive to clear Tunisia began on 19 April. On 7 May, British armor entered Tunis, and American infantry entered Bizerte. 6 days later, the last Axis resistance in Africa ended with the surrender of over 275,000 prisoners of war. The U.S. Army learned bitter lessons about the inadequacy of its training, equipment, and leadership in the North African campaign. Army ground forces acted quickly to ensure that American soldiers would receive more realistic combat training. Higher commanders realized that they could not interfere with their subordinates by dictating in detail the positions of their units. Troops had to be committed in division size, combined arms teams, not in driblets. The problem posed by American tanks, outgunned by the more heavily armed and armored German panzers, took far longer to correct, but the artillery established itself as the Army's most proficient arm. Sicily and Italy. Meeting in Casablanca in January 1943, President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, and the combined chiefs of staff decided that the large Italian island of Sicily would be their next target. Montgomery's British forces landed on the southeast coast, while Patton's newly activated 7th Army landed on the southwest, with the mission of seizing airfields and protecting the flank of the British Drive. Airborne troops spearheading the attacks scattered wide of their targets, but managed to disrupt enemy communications. Hours after the initial landings on 9th July, German armor struck the American beaches. Naval gunfire, infantry counterattacks, and the direct fire of field artillery landing at the critical juncture broke up the German formations. But 2 attempts to reinforce the beaches with parachute and glider-borne troops ended in disaster when Allied anti-aircraft batteries mistook the transport planes for enemy aircraft and opened fire, causing severe loss. Meanwhile, the Germans solidly blocked the British drive on the Sicilian capital Messina. General Sir Harold R. L. G. Alexander, Allied ground commander, ordered Patton to push toward Palermo at the western tip of the island. Once in Palermo, since the British drive was still stalled, his forces attacked Messina from the north. Patton used a series of small amphibious end runs to outflank German positions on the northern coastal road. American and British troops arrived in Messina on the 17th of August, just as the last Axis troops evacuated Sicily. In late July, the Allies decided to follow up their success in Sicily with an invasion of Italy. Having lost hope of victory, the Italian High Command, backed by the king, opened secret negotiations with the Allies. The Germans, suspecting that Italy was about to desert the Axis, rushed in additional troops. The Germans swiftly disarmed the Italian army and took over its defensive positions. A British fleet sailed into the harbor of Taranto and disembarked troops onto the docks, while the U.S. Fifth Army under Lieutenant General Mark W. Clark landed on the beaches near Salerno on 9 September. The Germans reacted in strength. For 4 days, vigorous attacks by German armor threatened the beaches. But on 16 September, American and British forces made contact, and 2 weeks later, American troops entered Naples, the largest city south of Rome. Allied plans called for a continued advance to tie down German troops and prevent their transfer to France or Russia, while Hitler decided to hold as much of Italy as possible. As the Allies advanced up the mountainous spine of Italy, they confronted a series of heavily fortified German defensive positions, anchored on rivers or commanding terrain features. The brilliant delaying tactics of the German commander in Italy, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, exacted a high price for every Allied gain. The campaign in Italy became an endless siege, fought in rugged terrain, in often appalling conditions, and with limited resources. Moving north from Naples, the Allies forced a crossing of the Volturno River in October 1943 and advanced to the Winter Line, a main German defensive position anchored on mountains around Cassino. Repeated attempts over the next 6 months to break or outflank it failed. An amphibious end run, landing the U.S. Fourth Corps under Major General John P. Lucas at Anzio in January 1944, failed to turn the German flank, for Lucas waited too long to build up his reserves before moving aggressively against the German defenses. Kesselring had time to call in reinforcements, including artillery, which soon brought every inch of Allied-held ground under fire. As the defenders dug in, the end run turned into another siege as American and British troops repulsed repeated counterattacks. Meanwhile, an American attempt to cross the Rapido River, timed to coincide with the Anzio landing, miscarried with heavy casualties. Allied efforts to blast a way through the enemy's mountain defenses proved futile, despite the use of medium and heavy bombers to support ground attacks around Cassino. Finally, in May 1944, a series of coordinated attacks by the Fifth Army and Eighth Army pried the Germans loose, and they began to fall back. On 4th of June 1944, 2 days before the Normandy invasion, Allied troops entered Rome. The Normandy invasion made Italy a secondary theater, and Allied strength there gradually decreased. Nevertheless, the fighting continued. The Allies attacked a new German defensive line in the northern Apennines in August, but were unable to make appreciable headway through the mountains. Not until spring of 1945 did they penetrate the final German defenses and enter the Po Valley. German forces in Italy surrendered on 2nd of May 1945. The cross-channel attack preparations for an attack on German-occupied France continued, as did the campaigns in the Mediterranean. The defeat of the German U-boat threat, critical to the successful transport of men and material across the Atlantic, had been largely accomplished by the second half of 1943. The success of the war against the U-boats was immeasurably aided by secret intelligence, codenamed Ultra, garnered by Anglo-American breaking of German radio communications codes. Such information also proved valuable to the commanders of the ground campaign in Italy and France. By early 1944, an Allied strategic bombing campaign so reduced German strength in fighters and trained pilots that the Allies effectively established complete air superiority over Western Europe. Allied bombers now turned to systematic disruption of the transportation system in France in order to impede the enemy's ability to respond to the invasion. At the same time, American and British leaders orchestrated a tremendous buildup in the British Isles, transporting 1.6 million men and their equipment to England and providing them with shelter and training facilities. Detailed planning for the cross-channel assault had begun in 1943 when the American and British combined chiefs of staff appointed a British officer, Lieutenant General Frederick E. Morgan, as Chief of Staff to the as-yet unnamed Supreme Allied Commander. When General Eisenhower arrived in January 1944 to set up Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, SHEF, Morgan's work served as the basis for the final plan of assault. The Allies would land in Normandy and seize the port of Cherbourg. They would establish an expanded lodgment area extending as far east as the Seine River. Having built up reserves there, they would then advance into Germany on a broad front. Ground commander for the invasion would be General Montgomery. The British Second Army would land on the left, while the American First Army under Lieutenant General Omar N. Bradley landed on the right. Intensive exercises and rehearsals occupied the last months before the invasion. An elaborate deception plan convinced the Germans that the Normandy landings were a feint, and that larger, more important landings would take place farther east around the Pas de Calais. Here, the Germans held most of their reserves, keeping their armored formations near Paris. Developments on the Eastern Front also aided the success of the invasion. In early 1943, the Russians destroyed a German army at Stalingrad. The Germans tried to regain the initiative in the summer of 1943, attacking a Soviet-held salient near the Russian city of Kursk. In the largest tank battle known to history, they suffered a resounding defeat. Henceforth, they remained on the defensive, in constant retreat, while the Soviets advanced west, retaking major portions of the Ukraine and White Russia during the fall and winter, and launching an offensive around Leningrad in January 1944. By March 1944, Soviet forces had re-entered Polish territory, and a Soviet summer offensive had prevented the Germans from transferring troops to France. On 5 June 1944, General Eisenhower took advantage of a break in stormy weather to order the invasion of Fortress Europe. In the hours before dawn, 6 June 1944, 1 British and 2 U.S. airborne divisions dropped behind the beaches. After sunrise, British, Canadian, and U.S. troops began to move ashore. The British and Canadians met modest opposition. Units of the U.S. 7th Corps quickly broke through defenses at a beach codenamed Utah and began moving inland, making contact with the airborne troops within 24 hours. But heavy German fire swept Omaha, the other American landing area. Elements of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions and the 2 and 5th Ranger Battalions clung precariously to a narrow stretch of stony beach until late in the day, when they were finally able to advance, outflanking the German positions. American and British beachheads linked up within days. While the Allies raced to build up supplies and reserves, American and British fighter aircraft and guerrillas of the French resistance blocked movement of German reinforcements. On the ground, Allied troops besieged Cherbourg and struggled to expand southward through the entangling Norman hedgerows. Earthen embankments, hundreds of years old, matted with the roots of trees and shrubs. The hedgerows divided the countryside into thousands of tiny fields. The narrow roads, sunk beneath the level of the surrounding countryside, became death traps for tanks and vehicles. Crossroads villages were clusters of solidly built medieval stone buildings, ideal for defense. With time short and no room to maneuver, the struggle to break out became a battle of attrition. Allied troops advanced with agonizing slowness from hedgerow to hedgerow in a seemingly endless series of small battles. Advances were measured in hundreds of yards. Requirements for fire support far exceeded pre-invasion planning, resulting in a severe shortage of artillery shells. The British made several powerful attempts to break through to the open country beyond the town of Caen, but were stopped by the Germans, who concentrated most of their armor in this threatened area. By 18 July, the U.S. First Army had clawed its way into St. Lo, and on 25 July, launched Operation Cobra as heavy and medium bombers from England pummeled German frontline positions. Infantry and armor finally punched through the defenses. Pouring through the gap, American troops advanced 40 miles within a week. Rejecting his general's advice, Hitler ordered a counterattack against the widening breakout by Germany's last available mobile forces in France. U.S. First Army forces stopped the Germans and joined Canadian, British, and Polish troops in catching the enemy in a giant pocket around the town of Falaise. Allied fighter bombers and artillery now aided a massive destruction of 20 enemy divisions. Suddenly, it seemed the Allies might end the war before winter. Calling off a planned halt and logistical buildup, Eisenhower ordered the Allied forces to drive all out for the German frontier. With enemy forces in full retreat, French and American troops rolled into Paris on 25th of August, 1944. Meanwhile, veteran U.S. and French divisions pulled out of Italy, landed on the beaches of the French Riviera, while French forces liberated the ports. The U.S. 7th Army drove northward in an effort to cut off withdrawing German troops. Moving rapidly through the cities of Lyon and Besançon, they joined up with Allied forces advancing from Normandy on the 11th September. Victory seemed to be at hand, but by mid-September, Allied communications were strained. Combat troops had outrun their supplies. British and Canadian forces advanced into the Netherlands, and American troops crossed Belgium and Luxembourg and entered German territory. Then, both met strong resistance. Bad weather curtailed unloading of supplies directly across the Normandy invasion beaches, while the ports on the North Sea and the Mediterranean was in ruins. As logistical problems piled up, Eisenhower rejected as too dangerous British pleas to channel all available resources into one deep thrust into Germany. He did, however, sanction one last bold gamble, Operation Market Garden. 2 U.S. and 1 British airborne division were to open the way for a British armored thrust to seize a bridge across the Lower Rhine at Arnhem in the Netherlands. The airborne troops took most of their objectives, but German resistance was much stronger than expected, and the operation failed to gain a bridgehead across the Rhine. Battles of attrition. There was to be no early end to the war. Despite its recent defeats, the German army remained a dangerous foe, fighting for its life in prepared defenses. Furthermore, as the Allies approached the frontiers of the Reich, they encountered a series of formidable terrain obstacles, major rivers, mountains, and forests, and the worst weather in over 30 years. Yet Eisenhower, believing that unremitting pressure against the enemy would shorten the war, called for the offensive to continue. Battles of attrition followed throughout October and November. All along the front, Canadian and British soldiers trudged through the frozen mud and water of the flooded tidal lowlands in the Netherlands to free the great Belgian port of Antwerp. The U.S. First Army took the German city of Aachen on 21st October. The drive of General Patton's Third Army toward the German border halted on 25th September due to shortages of gasoline and other critical supplies. Resuming the offensive in November, Patton's men fought for 2 bloody weeks around the fortress town of Metz, ultimately winning bridgeheads over the Saar River and probing the Siegfried Line. In the south, the U.S. 7th Army and the 1st French Army fought their way through the freezing rain and snow of the Vosges Mountains to break out onto the Alsatian plain around Strasbourg, becoming the only Allied armies to reach the Rhine in 1944. But there were no strategic objectives directly east of Strasbourg, and a pocket of tough German troops remained on the west bank, dug in around the old city of Colmar. The attacks by the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies toward the Roer River were extremely difficult. The Hortgen Forest, through which they moved, was thickly wooded, cut by steep defiles, fire breaks, and trails. The Germans built deep, artillery-proof log bunkers surrounded by fighting positions. They placed thousands of mines in the forest. In addition, they felled trees across the roads and wired, mined, and booby-trapped them, and registered their artillery, mortars, and machine guns on the roadblocks. Tree-high artillery bursts, spewing thousands of lethal splinters, made movement on the forest floor difficult. Armor had no room to maneuver. 2 months of bloody, close-quarters fighting in mud, snow, and cold was devastating to morale. Parts of at least 3 U.S. divisions, pushed beyond all human limits, experienced breakdowns of cohesion and discipline. The Battle of the Bulge. While the Allies bludgeoned their way into the border marches of the Reich, Hitler carefully husbanded Germany's last reserves of tanks and infantry for a desperate attempt to reverse the situation in the West. On 16 December, powerful German forces struck the lightly held sector of the 1st Army Front, south of Monschau in the Ardennes. German armored spearheads drove toward the Meuse River, aiming at Antwerp, aided by bad weather, a variety of deceptive measures, and the failure of Allied intelligence correctly to interpret the signs of an impending attack. They achieved complete surprise. Elements of 5 U.S. divisions, plus support troops, fell back in confusion. 2 regiments of the 106th Infantry Division, cut off and surrounded atop the mountainous Schnee Eifel, surrendered after only brief fighting, the largest battlefield surrender of U.S. troops in World War II. Partly as a result of the decision to continue attacking throughout the autumn, U.S. forces were spread thin in areas such as the Ardennes, and the Americans had few reserves to meet the attack. Schaeff immediately ordered available units into the threatened area, sending an airborne division into the important communications center of Bastogne. By 18 December, the magnitude of the German effort was clear, and Eisenhower ordered Patton's Third Army to disengage from its offensive toward the Saar and to attack the enemy's southern flank. Scattered American units, fighting desperate rearguard actions, disrupted the German timetable, obstructing or holding key choke points, road junctions, narrow defiles, and single-lane bridges across unfordable streams to buy time. Defenders at the town of St. Vith held out for 6 days. V Corps troops at Elsenborn Ridge repelled furious attacks, jamming the northern shoulder of the enemy advance. To the south, armored and airborne troops, although completely surrounded and under heavy German attack, held Bastogne for the duration of the battle. German efforts to widen the southern shoulder of the Bulge along the Saar River came to nothing. Short of fuel, denied critical road nets, hammered by air attacks, and confronted by American armor, the German spearheads recoiled short of the Meuse. Meanwhile, Patton had altered the Third Army's axis of advance and attacked northward, relieving Bastogne on 26 December. On the 3rd January, 1st and 9th Army troops and British forces launched attacks against the northern shoulder of the Bulge. Meanwhile, a secondary German offensive, Operation Nordwind, failed in the south. Eisenhower had ordered the 6th Army Group to fall back, pulling out of Strasbourg. General de Gaulle, the French leader, was enraged. After heated negotiations, Allied troops remained in Strasbourg, and the German attack lost its momentum. By the end of January, the Allies had retaken all the ground lost in both German offensives. The Battle of the Bulge was over, just as the Allies' August breakout had failed to achieve a war-winning decision. So too, the German attempt to reenact its victory of June 1940 failed. The Allies, however, could make good their losses, while Hitler had squandered almost all his remaining armor and fighter aircraft. To make matters worse for the Reich, the Soviets, on 12 January, opened a large-scale offensive in Poland and East Prussia that carried their troops to within 40 miles of Berlin. German forces that survived the Ardennes fighting had to be hurriedly shifted eastward to meet the growing Russian threat. The final offensive, with the elimination of the Bulge and the repulse of Nordwind, the campaign in the West moved into its final phases. The Allies paused only briefly before resuming the offensive. Eisenhower had earlier decided that his armies should advance to the Rhine all along its length before crossing. He wanted to shorten Allied lines, provide a defensible position in the event of further German counterattacks, and free troops to build up strong reserves. If Hitler persisted in defending every inch of German territory, most of the enemy's remaining forces would be destroyed west of the Rhine. Once across the river, American and British forces would be able to advance into Germany almost at will. Harmonizing conflicting British and American views remained one of Eisenhower's major problems. Rejecting British proposals to concentrate on one thrust north of the Ruhr under Montgomery's leadership, Eisenhower planned concentric attacks from the north by the British 21 Army Group and the U.S. 9th Army, and from the south by the U.S. 1st Army. Meanwhile, the 3rd Army would drive straight across Germany, and the 7th Army would turn southward into Bavaria. Because the United States now dominated the alliance, most of the significant tasks of the final campaign went to American commanders. First, a pocket of German resistance at Colmar had to be eliminated. Eisenhower assigned 5 additional U.S. divisions and 10,000 service troops to the effort. The Franco-American attack against the pocket began on 20 January and was over by early February. Meantime, the Canadian First Army cleared the area between the Maas and Rhine rivers. At the same time, the First Army advanced and finally seized the Roer River dams, but found that the Germans had destroyed the controls. The resultant flooding delayed the Ninth Army's advance by 2 weeks. That attack finally began in late February and linked up with the Canadians, cutting off German forces facing the British. Meanwhile, the First Army's drive to the Rhine culminated in the capture of Cologne, and on 7 March, the seizure of an intact bridge at the town of Remagen. As American divisions poured into the bridgehead, the 3rd and the 7th Armies launched coordinated attacks to the south. On the 22d and the 25th, 3rd Army troops made assault crossings of the Rhine. On 23 March, the British 2nd Army and the U.S. 9th Army staged massive crossings in the Ries-Wessel-Dinslaken area, supported by the largest airborne landings of the war, while the 7th Army crossed on the 26th near Worms. Now, Allied columns fanned out across Germany, overrunning isolated pockets of resistance. While Montgomery's forces drove northward toward the great German ports of Bremen, Hamburg, and Lübeck, the 9th Army advanced along the Axis Münster-Magdeburg, and 1st Army troops met on 1st April, encircling the industrial region of the Ruhr and capturing 325,000 prisoners. The First Army continued eastward toward Kassel and Leipzig, while the Third Army rolled through Frankfurt, Eisenach, and Erfurt toward Dresden, then southward toward Czechoslovakia. The Sixth Army Group advanced into Bavaria toward Munich and Salzburg, denying the Germans a last-ditch defense in the Bavarian or Austrian Alps. Germany was shattered. Nevertheless, Eisenhower resisted British pressure to drive on to Berlin. He saw no point in taking casualties to capture ground that, in line with earlier agreements between Allied leaders, would have to be relinquished to the Soviets once hostilities ceased. His objective remained to capture or destroy the remnants of the German armed forces. The Soviets massed 1.2 million men and 22,000 pieces of artillery, and on 16th April began their assault upon the city. As that battle raged, British, American, and Soviet forces neared previously negotiated stop lines along the Elbe and Mulde rivers. The First Army made contact with Soviet troops on 25th April around Torgau. Meanwhile, as the Third Army entered Czechoslovakia, and British troops reached the Baltic, the Russians moved through the streets of Berlin. On 30th April 1945, Hitler committed suicide in a bunker beneath the ruins of his capital. German forces in Italy surrendered effective 2 May, and those in the Netherlands, northwestern Germany, and Denmark on 4th May. Patrols of the U.S. 7th Army driving east through Austria, and the 5th Army driving north from Italy, met near the Brenner Pass. On 7th May, the German High Command surrendered all its forces unconditionally, and 8th May was officially proclaimed VE Day. Though peace had come to Europe, one of the most culturally and economically advanced areas of the globe lay in ruins. Germany, the industrial engine of the continent, lay prostrate, occupied by British, French, American, and Soviet troops. Britain, exhausted by its contribution to the victory, tottered near economic collapse, while France was totally dependent on the United States. The Soviet Union had suffered in excess of 20 million casualties and untold devastation, but its armed forces remained powerful and its intentions obscure. To the victory in Western Europe and Italy, the United States had contributed 68 divisions, 15,000 combat aircraft, well over 1 million tanks and motor vehicles, and 135,000 dead, the country now turned its focus to a war a half a world away and to the defeat of Japan in the Pacific.